Welcome to Social Science Matters, a podcast series from the HIFNB with Kim.
And Jan. This is dedicated to exploring the important world of social science research in the marine environment.
Welcome on board.
Okay, welcome back to Social Science Matters and to episode 1. What is social science and marine social science? So in this episode, we're tackling the fundamental question what social science is and why does it matter for marine research. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Jan. It's great to be here for episode 1.
Yeah, exactly. So for defining social science, can you give us a bit of a rundown of the definition?
Well, I feel nervous defining social science because, of course, it's such a broad field, something that we've talked about considerably between us both. So what is social science? I think on a very broad level, social science is effectively the study of society. It's the study of people. And that is done in many, many different ways. Social science itself is not a discipline. It's something that's constituted of lots of different disciplines. So we can study human society, we can study people through many different lenses. We can think about them as a pair of glasses, if you will. Mm-hmm. And each time you put on a different pair of glasses, it's a different discipline. So we could look at human society, we could look at people through an anthropological lens. So anthropology is the study of human society in very kind of embedded ways. Mm-hmm. We might also look at it through sociology. That tends to be interested in social structures of society on that kind of, not always, but on a more meta scale and thinking about the structures or systems of society. We could think about human society and people through an economic lens, so another pair of glasses. Yeah. And that way we would be focusing on what are the economic dimensions that relate to people and society. We could look at it through a political science lens, and that, of course, has international relations as well. So that kind of political steer to thinking about the organization of societies, the operation of societies, the way that societies may both cement power relations but also push back against them. I should also say that I belong to another social science discipline myself. I was just gonna ask. Yeah, I mean, I'm a geographer. Yeah. And geography as a discipline is about the relationships between people, space and place. So we have a kind of spatial dimension to our study of human society and people. So when you hear social science, you can't think about it as being one thing. So it's exactly the same as you would have in the natural sciences. So we wouldn't say, oh, natural sciences is a discipline. It's not. It's constituted of what are the different natural science disciplines? Jan, name a few for us.
There's so many. But recently they're more blending back into each other. So interdisciplinary science becomes a big thing again. So I like that very much.
But yeah, and I think you're quite right, because the whole point of this podcast is to think about the relationships between disciplines as well. And there are overlaps between social science disciplines, and oftentimes different social science disciplines will actually be reading the same literature. They'll read it a little bit differently, but they will be reading the same kinds of ideas and taking potentially different things from them. So social science ultimately is that relationship between people and the world, and thinking about human society and thinking about people. I do want to say a few things about the humanities as well, actually. This podcast is called Social Science Matters, but you'll often hear, particularly in the marine social sciences, you'll hear people also talking about the blue humanities, you'll hear people talking about ocean humanities, and the humanities, there are overlaps here. The humanities disciplines are also interested in arts, in culture, but of course culture and society are deeply entwined. So this podcast series will not be explicitly about the blue humanities or the ocean humanities, but we'll touch on some of those. You know, anthropology can be considered as a humanities discipline. Human geography can be considered as a humanities discipline. So these lines are, you mentioned the fluidity, the integration between different disciplines. So it's worth making that note that when we talk about social science and the marine social sciences, we are talking about a variety of different disciplines that have overlaps between them that are, like the sea itself, a little bit fluid.
Wonderful.
So one last thing, Jan, if I may. I think the other thing to say about social science, and particularly in the context of marine social science, is it is the study of human society and people.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes we can think about social science as being the way towards the communication of natural science.
Mm-hmm.
And science communication is a field of social science research, a very important one.
Yep.
It's very important. So when we think about how do we communicate with societies, how do we share information with communities, with individuals? So this is a substantial and important field of social science, but it's not the only one. So there are many questions we can ask about society, about people, individuals, communities across different scales. And I think it's really important, particularly in interdisciplinary research, that we see the real breadth of what social science can offer. So yeah, it's big.
Very, very big. And it uses a range of methods as well. So just as the social sciences are as diverse as you just outlined them, so are the methods. So there's no single social science method.
No, and also, and we're going to be talking about this more in our next episode, there's also not one singular theory either.
Right.
So we'll be talking a little bit about one of my favourite topics. So get ready to fall asleep, listeners. I'll be talking about theory and philosophy in our next episode. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's not one singular theory that dictates or drives a social science approaches or social science disciplines in the way they might attend to the marine environment. But likewise, there's not one singular method either. So the first thing to say is that social sciences, as we mentioned, are very broad and span many, many different disciplines and disciplines in conversation with each other and disciplines in conversation with natural science disciplines. Methods can be both quantitative and qualitative and mixed in their approach. So when we talk about quantitative methods, we are talking about methods that are mainly numerical in their form, where we may be seeking to test hypotheses or be able to make claims, where we're able to say, this is the percentage of this is the correlation between this factor and that factor. So what is the relationship between, for example, coastal communities and what they think of pollution that's happening, and what about different segments of society, young, old, etc. So we can do quantitative analysis. We can also, and I know some of your work has looked at this, we can bring together analysis of different groups of people together with the natural science data to see how they understand some of those factors. So we can do quantitative social science, and that is a large part of social science research. There are also modes of social science research that are qualitative. Now, that research is very interested in kind of subjective meaning. So here we're not necessarily interested in making a particular claim of this is the correlation, this is the percentage, this is the number, but actually this is meanings-driven research. So why do people come to care about the environment as they do? Why do particular things matter to them? Another play on the word matters. This is research where we would use methods that enable you to get at depth in terms of, now that's not to say that, I don't want to draw that line, that quantitative research is not deep. Much quantitative research is very deep in its analysis. It's very technical, it's very complicated. It brings together a huge array of skills using a number of different techniques, mathematical modeling techniques, softwares, everything from Python to R to other softwares that you would, and things that you would engage to do that. With qualitative research, what I mean by deep is it gets us to questions that quantitative research can't answer, which is why oftentimes you bring them together in mixed methods research, where we might mold together two different types of research, quantitative and qualitative, together to address the particular topic that is there. But I have said a little bit about quantitative research. Qualitative research, what kinds of methods might we use? There's a whole variety, and they're used across those disciplines that I just mentioned. And they may include things such as the interview. So the interview is probably one of the most common forms of qualitative method. There is quite a famous quote that gets used oftentimes, which is, an interview is a conversation with a purpose, a bit like this podcast.
Oh, wonderful.
And so basically that interviews can be done in a structured way, they can be done in a semi-structured way, they can be done in an unstructured way. So each of these methods also have their complexities to them. So interviewing is often used. It's used by geographers, it's used by sociologists, it's used by anthropologists. There are other methods, oral history interviews, which are much longer interviews over often a period of time with one person and then a set of people. There are ethnographic or participant observation methods. That means embedding yourself with communities or groups to work with them to understand their social worlds. There are also secondary materials. So just in quantitative research, we might use existing data that's already out there. A good example would be if you're doing population research, you might use existing censuses of population. And in qualitative research, you can also use stuff that's already out there. So we might use a set of resources such as newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, because those are all things that make meaning about our world. So for example, how would a popular documentary about the marine world construct meaning about the way that our world is degrading or changing? So qualitative social scientists could analyse those what we call secondary materials. So yeah, there's a big diversity in social science methods. So there's qualitative, quantitative, mixed, that produce different types of knowledge, subjective knowledge, objective knowledge. And together, these things help us to understand, going right back to earlier in our podcast, human society and people.
Perfect. And we will have an episode or multiple episodes dedicated to those different methods, right?
We will. So that's the plan, is that if you continue to listen to this series, we will cover each of those methods that we've just mentioned. So certainly interviewing, you're going to find there. You'll also find surveys, which are typically used. Well, we use those in both qualitative and quantitative research, because you can have open-ended questions on a survey, but you can also have survey questions that allow you to generate and capture quantitative or numerical data that you can test in different ways. So we'll be talking about that. We'll also be talking about participant observation and certainly secondary materials, which are very useful in understanding, again, human society and people and their relationships with the marine environment.
Okay, but so this is about marine social sciences in general, this series, and why marine social sciences? What's the catch here?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So in 2022, here at the HFMB, where Jan and I are sat right now in our institute, we had a visitor who came to see us, Dr. Emma McKinley. And you'll find Emma's work on the resources that accompany some of our episodes, some of our podcast episodes here in the show notes. And when Emma came to visit us, she reminded us that the marine social sciences are not new. That actually the study of people in relation to the ocean actually goes back quite a few decades, but that it has gained a momentum and it has gained considerable traction over the last few years, I would say, or at least over the last decade and a bit, I would say. It's really begun to pick up speed. And there's several reasons for that. And one reason is that when we are thinking about our marine world, one of the things we're interested in often through a sort of scientific pair of glasses or a scientific lens is that we're interested in the fact that our oceans are changing. But they're changing for a very particular reason. They're changing oftentimes because of anthropogenic changes that humans are bringing to those oceans. So if people are part of the problem, if you will, then we have to understand what people are doing. But people are also part of the solutions, or at least part of how we might think towards how might we remedy this? Because ultimately change cannot happen without that human interaction. It's people who govern, it's people who make policy, it's people who, as everyday citizens, we choose the actions that we're part of. And actually, a lot of, I mentioned Emma's work again. Hello, Emma, if you're listening. One of the things about Emma's work, at least her earlier work, she had a good set of papers came out in 2010 and 2012 that were about sort of ocean citizenship. And in those papers, she's very much making the case that me and you can make a difference. So thinking about people in relation to our oceans and our ocean health is really crucial. We can't think about oceans just as ecological systems. We always have to think about them in relation to people. Now, I mentioned theory earlier. Some people would say we have to understand the connections between people and the ocean. Some people would use the word connection. Okay. Some people would use the word relation. Some people would use the word entanglements. Yeah. Each of these means slightly different things in terms of how we come to view or how we come to understand the role of people with the ocean. Yep. I used with then as a kind of more neutral term. Ultimately, why marine social science? I think that really marine social science is so vital. Yep. It's such a vital part of how we understand what's happening with our oceans right now. And that's why we see things such as, our institute that is really invested, I think, in interdisciplinary marine science, so bringing together natural science and social sciences together. That marine element is so important. The other thing to say that I think is very important is that social science is not an add-on to natural science.
Exactly, yeah, very important.
Yeah, and we'll talk a bit more about this as we go through the podcast series, but oftentimes, and I think this is still predominantly the case, when projects are designed, oftentimes funding councils will sort of have a steer towards the more natural science side, and then they'll say, oh, well, actually, no, well, people are kind of important. And you get a structure of grant that tends to have social science sort of tacked on the end. But I really think the future is about the integration, and we're seeing that particularly, and again, I'll draw on your work, Jan, which really does begin to think about that integration more fully. So social science, when we think about the marine social sciences, they are both something that is discrete. There are marine social sciences that exist without natural science as a component of them. Yeah. So that study of human societies and the ocean, and people's interactions, relationships, entanglements, connections to the ocean. There are social sciences that come together with the natural sciences, but I think very much they should be with the natural sciences, not as an add-on to, and not as an afterthought to. Yep. And I think that's really important for the future of marine social science. A great paper came out recently by Stefan Partolo and colleagues that talks about the amount of marine social science research that's happening. It's still small within the marine sciences more generally, but I hope we'll continue to see it grow.
Yeah. Yeah, shout out to the In Common podcast, hosted in part by Stefan Partolo.
Yeah, it's a great one. And you will find some of those podcasts are on our resources, on the show notes.
Exactly. Okay, thank you for highlighting the importance of people here. This is really, really vital. Do you have some real-world examples that we can highlight?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I want to also turn back to you as well, Jan, on this for some real-world examples. I mean, just on the importance of people, I think one thing that marine social science has been really great for is also addressing dimensions of power. We can't think about people and people's relationship to the marine environment without talking about this word power, because there are uneven relationships that people have with the marine environment. There are certain people or groups of people or sectors or industries that take from the marine environment, that exploit the marine environment, that use it in particular ways. There are other people who will aim to steward and protect the environment. There are other people who may have their marine resources, they may be subject to dispossession of those resources. Yeah. So really, you can't talk about people without talking about power. And the marine social sciences really brings this into view. And I think that's crucially
Absolutely.
important. And we can see that in some of the work that happens here at the HFMB. In my group, Dr. Paula Sartisabal, her work deals with this very acutely in terms of thinking about power dimensions of local people, artisanal and small-scale fishers. But we see this in other examples as well of those power dimensions. I'm happy to talk a bit more about those, but actually, I've talked a lot in this podcast, Jan. Could you give us an example of how the social sciences have come into the work that you've done?
Yep. So we've actually conducted a survey where we asked experts on biodiversity change on the Wadden Sea, which is in the southern North Sea, and Algoa Bay in South Africa. So these were stakeholders that have expertise in biodiversity change, and we asked them how biodiversity change, so the changes in different aspects of biodiversity, have affected parts or can affect parts of human life. So nature's contributions to people more specifically, and we actually found that the material contributions weren't changing so much. So things like food and the fish we catch from the ocean, for instance, that didn't change so much with biodiversity change, but actually the relational values that you have with the ocean, they changed a lot and they were most affected. So yeah, that was with a survey where we had open-ended questions where people could more elaborate, so a qualitative method, and closed-ended questions where they could answer certain statements on a scale from 0 to 4. And that paper is currently in review, so it'll come out soon.
So watch this space on that paper. And also, if you're interested in that project, there is also a blog post on our website that's about the construction of that survey and the work that was done with our global sustainability scholars who Jan was supervising in helping develop that project as well. Yeah. So I mean, that's such a good example, and also of those mixed methods approaches and the way that we can use a survey with both qualitative and quantitative, as we were talking about just earlier. Another example from some research that's happened in our group, I want to talk a little bit about marine invasive species. So a good example of what a marine social science lens can bring to this, and I'm a scholar who studies governance, so governance is my particular window, if you will, into marine social science. I'm interested in how the oceans are governed. So how does regulation happen? How does it work? How does it fail? Why does it fail? Why are we in a place where we don't have the kind of change we might be looking for. But with one project that we had that was a collaboration with Dr. Catherine Samler, who now works at the University of Twente in Enschede in the Netherlands, and my former colleague, Dr. Satya Savitsky, we were looking at invasive species management and something called the Ballast Water Management Convention. And this is a piece of regulation that gets put into place that aims to think about the management of the ballast tank on a ship. Now, the ballast tank is the thing that weighs a ship. So a ship goes around the world with its cargo, and then when it offloads the cargo, it's not weighted the same. So you often fill up something called a ballast tank with water that rebalances the ship. Then the ship goes off to its next destination. It lets out the ballast water somewhere new, somewhere different, and then picks up its next bit of cargo. Now, this the ballast tank is often a vector for marine invasive species. And we were looking at the ballast water management convention. And one thing that we wanted to understand through a social science and the relationship between people and the ocean is, why do we still have a problem if we have a convention? And one of the things that Satya's work had started to look at was by doing interviews, so interviews as a method, also looking at policy analysis, secondary analysis, so looking at the policy document yourself. Actually, how this governance operates is through seafarers. Seafarers have to test the ballast tank. They have to test that ballast tank to see what's in there. So we're asking everyday people to effectively be scientists. We're also asking seafarers to do another job on top of a very busy job that seafarers do, navigating vessels around our world, where they work incredibly long hours. Maria Brovanic's work in New Zealand, she looks at the stresses and strains that are put on global seafaring communities. And it's really tough all of a sudden to ask seafarers to do another job. And so why does this governance fail? We understand that by employing marine social science methods, by doing interviews, by looking at policy documents, speaking with people, we can understand why governance works, how it can work, but also how it might not work.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Just one example there, Jan.
Nice, perfect. Thank you so much for this. Then we'll hear each other again in our next episode. How to start thinking about social science worlds.
I look forward to it already.
Yeah, me too. See you next time.
Want to dive deeper? You can find resources for every episode in the show notes.
And please share your questions, thoughts, and experiences on social media using the hashtag Social Science Matters.